Good morning and welcome to the 29th meeting of the committee in 2019. I'd like to remind members and the public to turn off mobile phones, and any members accessing committee papers should please ensure that their electronic devices are turned to silent. We have apologies from Kenneth Gibson, MSP, and Emma Harper, MSP, is attending the meeting as a substitute for Kenneth Gibson. The first item of business today on the agenda is the Stage 2 of the UEFA European Championships Scotland Bill. And I'd like to welcome the Minister, Ben McPherson, MSP, along with Lucy Carmichael, the Bill Team Leader, Kirsten Simonette Lefevre, Principal Legal Officer, and Gavin Seller, the Parliamentary Counsel. We shall just start immediately, and the question is that Section 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Agreed. That's all agreed. I'd like to call Amendment 1 in the name of Mike Rumbles, which is grouped with Amendments 35, 5, 6 and 32. I would like to point out that if Amendment 1 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendments 35 and 5 because of preemption. Furthermore, if Amendment 35 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendment 5 due to preemption. And I'd like to invite Mike Rumbles to move Amendment 1 and to speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. I move Amendment 1, and I'll technically move Amendment 1, and I'd like to speak with to all the amendments in the group. Essentially, Amendments 1, 35 and 5 are three different ways of approaching the whole issue of removing ticket touting. Now, I think everybody's agreed that we want to end the business of ticket touting. Just that is, what is the best way of achieving it? And so I put down Amendment 1 right at the beginning to leave out the exception for a named individual organisation, that is UEFA. So removing the touting offence does not apply to UEFA out of the bill. In discussions with the Minister, which I have to say I found very constructive and helpful, I'm not intending to move to continue to move one when it comes to the vote, but I urge members to accept Amendment 35, because what Amendment 35 does and what number 5 does not do. See, if I can just say what the Minister's Amendment number 5 does not do, it actually retains the named exemption of UEFA for this bill. Whereas my amendment at 35 actually is generic. It actually says, it removes in relation to acts done by UEFA and says, any act falling within subsection 3 done by the person responsible for operating the official sale platform for championship tickets. We heard in discussions, in evidence, that UEFA have no intention of ticket touting. And it always seemed to me bizarre, if they haven't got any intention of ticket touting, to exempt them from ticket touting in the bill. It seemed daft to me. More importantly, I think it sent out the wrong message. I think what we're trying to do, the Minister and myself, with all of these amendments, is to achieve an agreed position which makes sure that UEFA are not hurt by any of these, if I can put it that way. Of course I would, yeah.
So looking at your amendment number 35 and the Minister's amendment number 5, could you explain what you think is the key difference between the two?
Well, the key difference is the issue of actually naming UEFA. It's actually, if you think about it, what we want the Minister to do in the future, I think we're all agreed for this, is to bring forward a bill to remove ticket touting. And what we'd hopefully, when that bill eventually comes forward, it wouldn't have any exemptions in it for named organisations. It's much better, it's good practice in legislation to make sure that we have the law applying across the board to everybody without exceptions, named exceptions. That's the key. We're in the business of producing, this committee and the Parliament is in the business of producing good legislation. There's no side to this. I'm only interested in making sure that we produce good legislation that applies across the board. I think, if I may say so, it's an easy opt-out to say, oh, well, we'll give UEFA an opt-out here. No, let's get it right. And I must say, without going into detail, the words put down here have been checked in my Amendment 35 by officials. And so they're happy with that it is a generic approach to this whole thing, and it's not an individual approach. That's the real difference. Now, I hope the Minister will accept that 35. I rather hope he wouldn't hear the debate from others, of course, but I hope that he wouldn't move Amendment number 5, because actually number 35 is superior, and it's not because it's in my name. I'd actually preferred it if the Minister had lodged it, and I thought we had an agreement on this, but actually it turns out we had a misunderstanding, but I think I'll leave it there.
I'd like to invite the Minister to speak to Amendment 5 and all other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, everyone. And I would also like to start by thanking Mike Rumbles for that explanation of his amendments and for the constructive discussions we've had since stage 1, and for proposing not to press Amendment 1. I would also like to just take this opportunity to thank members again for their scrutiny of the bill to date, and for the recent discussions I've had with a number of members about the Scottish Government's proposed amendments. I know that everyone around the table supports the successful delivery of the Euro 2020 in Glasgow, and following the draw for the Nations League playoffs, we know what Scotland will have to do to reach the finals, and coverage of those games in March next year will no doubt increase the profile of and heighten the enthusiasm for the Championship in general. As we get near the Championship, I want to work with you all to reach consensus as far as possible on the bill, and I think that the Stage 2 amendments I have brought forward address the majority of the committee's concerns, and where I haven't been able to directly address a recommendation, I've been clear why. Of course, there were also recommendations in the Stage 1 report which do not require amendment of the bill. For example, Claire Baker has highlighted the need to ensure that a more systematic review of how the legislation operates in practice should take place than was the case for the Glasgow Commonwealth Games Act 2008, and I agree and have committed to ensuring that we evaluate and learn from this bill. I now turn to this group of amendments. Much of this discussion during the Stage 1 debate focused on the detrimental effect of ticket touting on events more generally, which often results in people paying highly inflated prices for tickets that may not even be valid for entry. And I'm determined that this will not happen for Euro 2020 in Scotland, and think that the provisions in the bill that ban touting will help to protect commercial rights in this area, and most importantly ensure that as many football fans as possible are able to attend matches during the Championship. The provisions in the bill to ban touting of Championship tickets for profit have been broadly supported, both by Parliament and more generally. However, where the principles behind the bill provisions are supported, there can be room for the detail of the provisions to be improved, and so I very much welcome the feedback from the committee in this area at Stage 1, and I have lodged amendments 5 and 6, which I believe respond to this feedback. Amendment 5 will make clear that UEFA's exemption from ticket touting offences does not allow it to sell tickets above face value, which has been a concern for some. And I hope that this restriction allows us to reach a compromise in this area, making clear that nobody, including UEFA, is permitted to sell a ticket above face value for commercial gain. UEFA has already provided public assurances that it will not sell tickets above face value, and has confirmed that this amendment will not create any issues in terms of its ticket sales for the event. I understand that in lodging 35, Mike Rumbles is trying in good faith to avoid specifically singling out and naming UEFA for an exemption for presentational reasons, as Mike Rumbles has argued. But because the policy intent of the amendment is in essence the same as the current drafting in the bill, in ensuring that the authorised seller of tickets can conduct initial sales and resales without being caught by the offence. However, from my position, the the fact is that UEFA is responsible for authorising all primary and secondary ticket sales. And as that is the case, I think that the most straightforward and transparent drafting is to acknowledge that fact through the bill in setting out a clear exemption for UEFA by name, albeit with the restriction proposed under Amendment 5, as I've just mentioned. I can see that Amendment 35 could be made to work, but if the committee were to support it, then I would want to do further analysis to make sure that this was the case. For example, in relation to hospitality packages, this is a potential issue with Amendment 35 that has only been identified in the last few days. My preference would therefore be to avoid any doubt by sticking with the specific mention of UEFA in the bill. So, for the reasons I've set out, I do not support making any further changes to this section of the bill beyond my own Amendment 5.
Thank you for giving way. Minister's just confirmed to the committee that there's absolutely no policy difference between 35 and 5. The issue is a simple one. The issue is whether we identify UEFA specifically as an exemption, or whether we write into legislation that applies to all without mentioning UEFA. And I think the advantage of 35 is clear in that there can't be a misunderstanding, there can't be even a false false misconception that we are somehow advertising that we're making UEFA special. This is a generic 35, and as the ministers have just pointed out, there is no policy difference. I take what he said about hospitality, and I think the way to address this, if there is an issue, which I haven't seen, and I can't see it myself, but I take the minister's word that there might be an issue, well, that's what we have stage 3 for. Stage 2 is to get the legislation, the principles of legislation right, and if there's any tweaking to do, which I would be very supportive of at stage 2 to get it absolutely certain so everybody was happy about it, then I would agree with that. But I think we should really focus on what the issue is here.
Minister.
May I continue?
Oh, of course, yes.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Rumbles, for that intervention. As stated, we think it's more transparent and clearer to name UEFA, but also Amendment 35 does not make clear that the official platform cannot sell tickets above face value, and that would be another problem if Amendment 35 were to pass. However, I think that we've had a constructive debate on this. My preference would be for the inclusion of Amendment 5 and the rejection of 35. I thank Mr Rumbles for the engagement constructively on that. Convener, if I can now turn to Amendment 6. This responds to the committee's Stage 1 report and creates an exemption from the touting offence where a ticket is auctioned by a charity or the proceeds are given to charity. Given that the touting offence applies within and out with Scotland, this amendment exempts charities that are registered in the Scottish Charity Register, but also charities established under the law of the rest of the United Kingdom or the EU, which are managed or controlled wholly or mainly out with Scotland. The exemption applies to such non-Scottish charities provided they are registered in a register corresponding to the Scottish Charity Register, or the body's purposes consist only of one or more of the charitable purposes set out in Section 7, subsection 2 of the Charities and Trustees Investments Scotland Act 2005. It is designed to ensure that the bill includes a protection that any charity benefiting from an auction has a purpose that would be considered to be charitable in Scotland. The Scottish Government has informed the Scottish Charity Regulator about this amendment, and we understand that it will be important to raise awareness about the exemption, if supported today, among charities and others who may hold an auction, for instance, through Oscar's newsletter for charities. The committee also recommended local organising committee members raise awareness of the need for organisations holding a charity auction to contact UEFA to ensure that the ticket is valid for entry to the match. I can confirm that the Scottish Government and its partners will seek to do this when raising awareness about the bill more generally, and will also look for specific opportunities related to charities. Finally, Amendment 32 adds provision for the Scottish Government ministers to specify through regulations the date on which the sections of the bill relating to ticket touting, sections 2, 3 and 4, come into force. This is to ensure that the offence can come into force as soon as possible in order to deter ticket touting in advance of the championship beginning and to allow action to be taken if this does occur. I ask the committee to support Amendments 5, 6 and 32, and I ask Mike Rumbles, and I thank Mike Rumbles for saying that he will not press Amendment 1, and ask him to reconsider pressing 35, but if he does press 35, I ask the committee to reject that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. I'd now like to invite other members of the committee to contribute if they wish. Donald Cameron and then Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Convener, and welcome to the Minister this morning. Can I return to the issue of Amendment 35 versus Amendment 5 in the Minister's name? And can I support Mike Rumbles in what he was saying? It is quite a curious issue, this, and I remember it was me who asked the question of UEFA when they gave evidence, did they ever sell a ticket above face value? And they said they did not. But I do think Mike Rumbles is right, and his amendment is a neat and simple way of changing what was originally in the bill. I think it's important that the wording is generic. I do find it very strange to see an individual named organisation to be exempted from a criminal offence, which should be of general applicability. And I support what Mike Rumbles said in that regard. The Minister said in defence of his amendment that it contains the wording around amounts exceeding the ticket's face value. But of course, we already have a definition of touting in subsection 2 of the bill, because we learn from subsection 2 that a person touts a championship ticket if the person does any act falling within subsection 3 in relation to the sale or proposed sale of a championship ticket for an amount exceeding the ticket's face value. So we have that definition already, and in a way, the Minister's amendment is repetitive, in my view, because it repeats a definition that we already have. And so for all those reasons, Convener, I would like to support Mike Rumbles in his approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Cameron. Stuart McMillan.
Thank you. It's, Minister, you mentioned earlier on regarding the hospitality packages, and that this is an issue that arose over the last recent time. Could you provide some further information on why the hospitality packages have become an issue, please?
I can't come back in on that. This, having had constructive engagement with Mike Rumbles around 35, the considerations around hospitality packages has emerged in recent days because these are not sold through the official platform that UEFA uses, so would create an additional consideration at stage 3 if Mike Rumbles' Amendment 35 were to pass today at stage 2. And that is a consideration that has emerged through analysis of 35 in preparation for today's committee. And my understanding is that UEFA have expressed this to us in recent correspondence.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Annabel Ewing.
Good morning, Minister. Going back to Mr Rumbles' Amendment 35, and the question that I posed to Mr Rumbles, perhaps I can pose it now to the Minister. What is the key difference? I'm a lawyer by trade, and I'm sort of struggling a wee bit here. What is the key difference from your perspective in terms of your amendment versus Mr Rumbles' amendment? And could you perhaps clarify? I thought I had heard you say in earlier remarks that if the committee were to pass Mr Rumbles' amendment number 35, that you would be keen to ensure that if there were any drafting issues that presented a problem from a legal perspective, that you would be happy to work on that. I'm not sure if I'm traducing what you said. I thought that's what you said.
On the latter point, yes. If 35 were to be passed by the committee today, we of course, Scottish Government, myself, would of course work to make sure that that amendment was then refined as may be necessary at stage 3. However, the reason, as stated in my remarks, the preference around Amendment 5 instead of Amendment 35, in my view, is that removing UEFA as a named exemption would be purely presentational, whereas UEFA as the organisation that will be the only seller of tickets should be exempted, because Mike Rumble's Amendment 35 essentially does exempt UEFA, but not in name, and as the authorised seller rather than specifically naming UEFA. And for clarity of drafting and clarity of law, I believe it is better to stick with Amendment 5, because that still names UEFA in itself, but also it seeks to address some of the points raised by the committee at stage 1. So amending the bill to an extent, but continuing with the naming of UEFA, because UEFA will be the authorised seller of tickets, both initially and then through their official resale platform.
Thank you. Claire Baker.
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, I think I do agree with Annabel Ewing about the two amendments basically doing the same thing. And if I ask Mike Rumbles, is there concerns what the desire to not name UEFA is? Is it concerns about precedents for future legislation? But then, again, this is a time-limited piece of legislation that is called the UEFA Championship Bill. It's obviously about UEFA. So if I could address that question, and if the Minister has, I understand the answer you've given to Annabel, but if there's any problems with exempting UEFA, not mentioning UEFA within anything further to what you've already said.
Could I intervene?
Hold on, can we go through the chair? That's all right. Have you completed?
Yes, I have, Convener.
Are there any other members that wish to contribute at this stage? And then I'll move to Mr Rumbles to sum up. No other members? Okay, Mr Rumbles.
Thanks very much, Convener. Very interesting debate, and it's really actually refreshing to be able to debate something which is not political, and it's in the world of politics as we are. It's purely to make sure that we get this right, and that's my concern, the job of the committee. I mean, the job of the Minister is to produce a bill, and our job is to scrutinise the bill, and I think that's what we're doing, and I think we're doing it as a committee a good job in scrutinising it. And the purpose of scrutinising it is to actually lodge amendments to improve the bill. My Amendment 35 improves this bill in my humble view. Unfortunately, number 5 is an amendment which doesn't actually change the bill. It doesn't change it. So although it is technically it is an amendment, it leaves the bill the same, because what the bill does is identify UEFA, and the Minister was quite clear about that. The only issue, there are two issues. One is about, and they're combined. One is about naming the actual organisation when we are producing law, which is to apply. This law is to apply across the board to everybody. We should not be, as a matter of principle, exempting organisations in this way when we know that we're going to come back to this, because the Minister was saying so. The government would like to come back to this issue to ban ticket touting across the board. And if we start by passing a law which exempts people from ticket touting, that is not, in my view, good law. The Minister actually used the phrase clarity of law, and I couldn't agree more with him. I couldn't agree more. And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to make this law absolutely clear that it applies to everybody. Of course, of course.
Can we go through the chair, please?
Chair, may I?
Yes, you may. You may intervene, Minister. Yes.
Thank you. Just to clarify on the point that I made in my opening remarks with regard to that. I believe that it is the most straightforward and transparent drafting to acknowledge the fact through the bill that UEFA is responsible for authorising all primary and secondary ticket sales, and in setting out a clear exemption for UEFA by name, albeit with the restrictions proposed under Amendment 5, is the most transparent way to do that. Because Amendment 5 does present what is a partial exemption for UEFA. It carves out from the selling for profit part of the touting offence, and only, but they still can't sell tickets for above face value, and the wording of the Amendment 5 makes that clear. So that is the differentiation that from the original drafting that Amendment 5 delivers, if passed.
Thank you for that. I repeat the point just in case people are not very clear about this. What Amendment 5 does is nothing. Amendment 5 doesn't change the bill, because the whole point in the bill is mentioning UEFA. The whole point of Amendment 5 is mentioning UEFA. So actually, although it technically is an amendment, it doesn't change the bill. It changes a few words in the bill. What I would say is, in answer to Claire Baker's point, the bill is time limited. Of course it is. Absolutely right. So what's the effect of not taking 35? Well, and taking 5. The effect of that, actually, really, there's no real effect. One is about, if you like, presentation. It's about saying to the world out there that we want to ban ticket touting, and we're not going to give exceptions to ticket touting. The people that sell the tickets, they have no intention. I mean, as Donald Cameron said, they made in the evidence to us, they made it clear they've got no intention of ticket touting. No intention at all. So why name them? And what is really good law is to have 35, which we could take in a bill to be brought forward in the future, I hope, by the Minister. And I'm sure he'd use the same words if we passed it today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Can I ask you, Mr Rumbles, it's a formality, but do you intend to press Amendment 1?
I don't intend to press Amendment 1.
And does any other member wish to move Amendment 1? Okay. I'd now like to call Amendment 35 in the name of Mike Rumbles, which has already been debated with Amendment 1. Mr Rumbles, do you wish to move Amendment 35?
I'd like to move Amendment 35.
Okay. I would remind members that if Amendment 35 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendment 5 on the grounds of preemption. The question is that Amendment 35 be agreed to. Are we agreed? No. There will be a division. Can those against please show? Okay. Those in favour?
Those abstaining.
Those abstaining?
Okay. So 4 for, 5 against, no abstentions. It's not
Okay.
agreed to.
So we have 5 against and 4 for the amendment. So the amendment is not agreed to. I now call Amendment 5 in the name of the Minister, which has already been debated with Amendment 1. Can the Minister move that formally, please?
Moved.
Thanks. The question is that Amendment 5 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. There will now be division. Those in favour of Amendment 5, please show. Those against? Those abstaining? Amendment 5 is therefore agreed to. The question is that Section 2 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? I now like to call Amendment 6 in the name of the Minister, which has already been debated with Amendment 1. Minister, can you formally move Amendment 6?
Moved, Convener.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 6 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The question is that Sections 3 to 5 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? I'd like to call now Amendment 7 in the name of the Minister, which is grouped with Amendments 8, 9 and 31. Minister, can I ask you to move Amendment 7 and speak to all other amendments in the group?
Thank you, Convener. I move Amendment 7, and the amendments in this group make minor changes to improve consistency and clarity in the definitions of the terms trading licence and existing street trader in the bill. Amendment 7 would make it absolutely clear that the definition of existing street trader at Section 6, subsection 5, is intended to apply throughout the Act, not only to Section 6, subsection 3C. Amendment 8 replaces the current reference in the definition of existing street trader at Section 6.5a to specific types of licence with a reference to the defined term trading licence. It also clarifies that Police Scotland, in addition to Glasgow City Council, can issue a trading licence. Licences issued by Police Scotland under the Peddlers Act 1871 are already included in the definition of trading licence in Section 33, so making this amendment makes these sections consistent. Amendment 9 makes clearer that existing street traders are only those who have a licence to trade in an event zone specified by the bill. Amendment 31 adds a market operator's licence granted by Glasgow City Council under Section 40 of the Civic Government Scotland Act 1982 to the definition of trading licence at Section 33. This type of licence is required for things like car boot sales. This amendment is intended to make consistent the definition of trading licence at Section 33 and the reference to a trading licence at Section 6 as modified by Amendment 8, and ensure that all affected street traders benefit from the protections offered by the bill. I ask members of the committee to support these amendments, and again I move Amendment 7.
Okay, thank you very much, Minister. I'm now going to invite other members who wish to contribute, but can I just remind members that it's not a question and answer session, it is a debate at stage 2, so if you wish to make your points, I will bring the Minister in at the end to wind up and address your points. So do any members wish to contribute to this section? No. Okay. Minister, do you wish to wind up?
I just encourage members to support the amendments in this group which make minor changes to improve the consistency and clarity to the definition of trading licence and existing street trader in the bill.
Okay, thank you very much. The question is that Amendment 7 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. I call Amendment 8 in the name of the Minister, which has already been debated with Amendment 7. Minister, can you formally move Amendment 8?
Formally moved, Convener.
Okay. The question is that Amendment 8 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. I'd like to call Amendment 9 in the name of the Minister, which has already been debated with Amendment 7. Minister, can you move formally?
Formally moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 9 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The question is that Section 6 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? And the question is that Sections 7 to 10 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you. I'd now like to call Amendment 2 in the name of Mike Rumbles in a group of its own. Mike Rumbles, I'd like to invite you to move and to speak to Amendment 2.
Not moved.
Does any member object?
Does any member object? No. Okay. So the question is that Section 11 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The question is that Sections 12 to 15 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? I'd like to call Amendment 10 in the name of the Minister, which is grouped with Amendment 29. Minister, can you move Amendment 10 and speak to other amendments in the group?
Thank you, Convener. During stage 1, concerns were raised about who could be an enforcement officer for the purposes of the bill, and that this might be defined too broadly in regulations, meaning that people with insufficient skills, experience or training could be appointed. There were also concerns about the use of private companies to provide enforcement officers, although this was never the Scottish Government's intention. In its Stage 1 report, the committee welcomed the offer from the Scottish Government to bring forward amendments at Stage 2 to make this position explicit within the bill, and I am glad to be able to do this through this group of amendments. Amendment 10 removes the power for Scottish ministers in Section 16, subsection 2b of the bill to specify in regulations other criteria that need to be met in order for an individual to be designated an enforcement officer by Glasgow City Council. The Amendment 10 replaces this power with a set of alternative criteria set out in Section 16 itself, that someone can be designated as an enforcement officer if they are authorised by a local authority to enforce the provisions of Section 92 of the Trademarks Act 1994, which is an existing offence concerning the unauthorised use of trademarks, or if they are employed by a local authority and are sufficiently experienced in exercising functions of the kind conferred on enforcement officers by the bill. The judgment about whether someone has sufficient experience would be made by Glasgow City Council. The existing alternative criterion at Section 16, subsection 2a, that someone can be designated as an enforcement officer if they are an inspector of weights and measures, remains unchanged. This amendment will ensure that all enforcement officers are employed by a local authority and that they have appropriate experience to carry out the role of an enforcement officer. As a consequence of Amendment 10, all of the criteria that would allow someone to be appointed as an enforcement officer are now included on the face of the bill. That means that the provision in Section 31, subsection 3, stating that the previous regulation-making power was to be subject to the negative procedure is no longer required, and Amendment 29 removes it. We are working closely with Glasgow City Council and other partners to ensure that we develop legislation which is workable on the ground. These amendments have been shared with Glasgow City Council, and it is confirmed that these provide sufficient scope to appoint appropriately qualified staff to enforce the bill's provisions. Neil Coulthart, Head of Trading Standards at the Council, also provided assurances to the committee during Stage 1 that training will be provided to enforcement officers on the provisions in the bill to ensure that they are able to carry out their role effectively and within the boundaries set in law. I ask members of the committee to support these amendments, and I move Amendment 10.
Thank you very much, Minister. Do any other members wish to contribute? Okay. Minister, would you like to wind up?
Well, thank you, Convener.
Okay. The question is that Amendment 10 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The question is that Section 16 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. I'd now like to call Amendment 11 in the name of the Minister, which is grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings. Minister, to move Amendment 11 and to speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. This group includes a number of amendments to the sections of the bill that deal with general enforcement powers and the powers of entry and search. I think that the enforcement powers and associated safeguards in this area of the bill generally achieve the policy intent, but acknowledge these provisions could be clarified or improved in some areas. The amendments that I've lodged attempt to do this, and from discussions that I've had with a number of committee members over the last few days, I believe that these amendments, and those in groups 6 and 7, do provide reassurance that the provisions in the bill on enforcement will be proportionate and clear and include appropriate safeguards. Amendment 11 strengthens the test for an enforcement officer to take action using the general powers under Section 17 from appropriate to necessary. This applies for the purpose of preventing or ending the commission of a championship offence, or in connection with proceedings or anticipated proceedings in respect of a championship offence. The strengthening of this test mirrors the strengthening of the test for when an enforcement officer may seek assistance from another person, the amendment for which is contained in the group is contained in Group 6. Amendment 15 adds new provision to Section 19 to make it explicit that search and entry by an enforcement officer may take place without a warrant where permission is given by the occupier or another person with the authority to do so, such as an owner or tenant. This was implicit in the bill provisions previously, An equivalent amendment in Group 7 makes it explicit that the use of reasonable force under Section 20 could only take place when no permission is granted. Amendment 16 makes clear that an enforcement officer's powers of entry and search under Section 19 do not extend to search an individual or access data stored electronically, for instance, on a smartphone or a laptop. This was already the policy intent, but concerns about these matters were raised by Ross Greer, and I hope this amendment provides the reassurances he was seeking about these important limits on an enforcement officer's powers. Amendment 26 adds a requirement to Section 23 for an enforcement officer to provide evidence of their identity in addition to evidence of their authority when requested to do so. This is intended to ensure that businesses and members of the public understand by whom enforcement action is being taken, as well as the powers that they are acting under. This type of provision can be found in other legislation, including the Consumer Rights Act 2015, which it is expected many enforcement officers will be used to enforcing. Finally, Amendments 14, 19 and 25 each provide additional signposting across the enforcement sections of the bill to make it clearer that these sections should be read together to fully understand the scope of and, importantly, restrictions on these powers. I now turn to Amendments 3 and 4 from Mike Rumbles, which I understand seek to address some of the points that were raised about the scope of enforcement officers' power during Stage 1. They do this by limiting the powers of entry and search to when an enforcement offence is being committed. Since the Stage 1 debate, I have, as has been said, met Mike Rumbles to discuss the bill, and following that conversation and the amendments that I have now lodged, I hope that he no longer intends to press these amendments, as my amendments in this group and in the other groups dealing with enforcement powers address his concerns. I would like to thank Mike Rumbles for his engagement on these matters, and I would welcome confirmation from him that he does not intend to press these amendments. In conclusion, I think that the range of amendments on enforcement powers in this group and others that we will reach later in today's proceedings address the points that have been raised by committee members during Stage 1 of the bill process, and in doing so I believe that they improve both the substance of the enforcement provisions and, importantly, their clarity. I move Amendment 11. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Mr McPherson. Mike Rumbles, can you speak to Amendment 3 and other amendments in the group?
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I'd like to also thank the Minister for constructive engagement on all of this issue, because what was evident to me from Stage 1 in the evidence session from the Minister, my concern had been that the bill as it was gave greater powers to enforcement officers than the police have, because the police cannot enter premises without a warrant, and they can only enter premises if they believe a current crime is about to be or is being committed. So the bill as it stood would have given greater powers to enforcement officers. Particularly the Minister's, when we asked him at Stage 1, he said the sections had to be read together because he felt that this was only about entering a property where permission was given, but it didn't actually say that in the bill. So I'm delighted that the Minister has come forward with all his amendments, but particularly Amendment 15, which is absolutely clear that where permission is given by the occupier, they may enter. So it actually removes any need for my two amendments, and I don't intend to move them.
Okay. Thank you very much. Do other members wish to contribute to this section? Ross Greer.
Thank you, Convener. I'd just like to thank the Minister for his engagement on this section. None of us were in any doubt on the need for enforcement officers to have appropriate powers, and we certainly realise that the intent of the legislation was not to empower enforcement officers to, for example, search individuals or search data stored on a laptop. But to have that explicitly clarified in the bill, I think, provides a really valuable civil liberties safeguard. And as Mr Rumble said, to make sure that the principle of consent when searches are being conducted is also on the face of the bill is a really important safeguard that then clarifies substantial following sections.
Thank you very much, Mr Greer. Any other members? No. Minister, would you like to wind up?
Thank you, Convener. I just thank Mike Rumbles for confirming that he will not press amendments 3 and 4 and for his remarks, and to Ross Greer as well. And I urge members of the committee to support the amendments I have lodged in this group. These make it clearer that the provisions on enforcement should be read together, strengthen the test for enforcement action to be taken, and ensure that enforcement officers need to provide evidence of their identity when exercising their powers. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. The question is that Amendment 11 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. I now call Amendment 12 in the name of the Minister, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings. Minister, can you move Amendment 12 and speak to all amendments in the group?
Thank you, Convener. There was a significant amount of discussion during stage 1 about the powers of an enforcement officer to call on the assistance of another person as provided for under Section 17 subsection 4 and Section 19 subsection 2 of the bill. The types of person that might be called on for assistance include locksmiths, tow truck businesses and hydraulic crane operators. These people have specialist skills or equipment that may be required to take action where the restrictions in the bill are breached. The Scottish Government does not expect that enforcement officers would call on assistance from other people as a matter of routine, but we think that it is important that enforcement officers have these powers in order to be able to take prompt, effective and, importantly, safe enforcement action. These are powers that are already available to enforcement officers under other legislation and that were available to them at the 2014 Commonwealth Games. However, I have listened to the concerns that have been raised that these powers are too wide-ranging and have brought forward a package of amendments in this group and in Group 8 to address these concerns. I will address my 4 amendments in this group in turn. Amendment 12 increases the legal threshold for when an enforcement officer can be assisted by any other person under Section 17, so that this test changes from being reasonably required to being one of necessity. My aim here is to provide further reassurance to the committee that an enforcement officer will carefully consider whether assistance from another person is absolutely necessary prior to requesting this. We heard from Glasgow City Council that enforcement officers would already be expected to do this and discuss this with more senior officers in the council if required. However, in strengthening the test in the bill, I want to ensure that it is clear that this should happen in all cases. Amendment 17 makes an equivalent change to Section 19, and Amendment 13 makes clear that a person assisting an enforcement officer under Section 17 must act under their direction, the direction of the enforcement officer, at all times, making this control explicit rather than implicit. I think that this should also provide reassurance to the committee that someone assisting an enforcement officer is not afforded the same powers as an enforcement officer. And again, Amendment 18 makes an equivalent change to Section 19. From discussions I've had with Ross Greer since stage 1, I understand that he has the same aim as I do in ensuring that there are appropriate safeguards in place so that effective and proportionate enforcement action will be taken under the bill generally. Amendments 33 and 34 in his name take a different approach to respond to considerations about an enforcement officer being assisted by another person by requiring that the police are notified before any request for such assistance takes place under Section 17 or 19. My view is that a notification to the police, whether that be face-to-face, by phone, email or another method, has scope to add confusion in terms of who is responsible for taking the decision about seeking assistance and would be likely to add unnecessary delay to the process. From a practical perspective, a notification would not be expected to have an effect on the outcome of the process to decide whether to seek assistance from another person, and would simply be used to record that a request for assistance had been made. As such, I think that this is best left as an operational process for Glasgow City Council and Police Scotland, and for these reasons I do not support the 2 amendments lodged by Ross Greer. In contrast, the 4 amendments I am proposing are included in this group, along with Amendment 21 in Group 7, that provides that a police constable must authorise the use of reasonable force by a third party, strengthen the objective assessment that has to be made before assistance can be sought, and also make clear who is responsible for directing the person providing assistance. I think that this means they will have a real practical impact on how the enforcement powers are used, and I would urge the committee members to support them. I move Amendment 12.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to invite Ross Greer to speak to Amendment 33 and other amendments in the group. Mr. Greer.
Thank you, Convener. Firstly, in reference to the Minister's amendments, I'd like to again thank him for his constructive engagement. I think that they do provide for necessary strengthening. In fact, that the amendment that is specifically in reference to the change to a test of necessity is a helpful one, and the clarity that third parties are operating under the direction of an enforcement officer and are not thus afforded the same powers themselves as an enforcement officer is very useful. These amendments are not mutually exclusive with my own, though. In fact, I think they are quite complementary. Amendments 33 and 34 lodged in my name do exactly the same thing, so I'll refer to them as one. They address the concerns that were raised by the committee in our Stage 1 report in the conclusion following Section 45 of the report. Amendments 33 and 34 ensure that the police are aware when a third party is being brought in. The intent here is to give them the opportunity to be present if they feel that's necessary, to raise concerns if they believe that those are necessary. At present, there's only a requirement for the police to be present if force is being used. But there are other scenarios where they may feel that it would warrant their presence. So, for example, the use of large vehicles, the example that was given to us during our Stage 1 evidence by Glasgow City Council on scenarios where a cherry picker may be used. So if you can imagine a scenario where that were to be used in proximity to a crowded area, to a significant number of people, and the police may feel that their presence would be warranted in such a scenario. The intent of this amendment is only about giving the police notice. The operational decisions about what they do are up to them. Operational decisions should be for the police. That shouldn't be in primary legislation. And these amendments are proportionate. They don't stop the enforcement officers from going about their duties, and they shouldn't delay them for more than the few seconds it would take to make a phone call, for example. The amendments don't prescribe a system for notification because, again, that should be an operational decision between the enforcement officers and their employer, Glasgow City Council, and the police. These amendments strike the right balance between appropriate oversight and the opportunity for the police to be involved as they believe is appropriate, and the ability of enforcement officers to complete their tasks in a timely manner. The amendments are exactly in line with the committee's unanimous conclusion at Stage 1, and I hope members will feel able to support them.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Greer, would any other members like to contribute to this section? Mr. Rumbles and then Mr. McMillan.
Thanks very much, Convener. I think these amendments, I'll be supporting all the amendments because they are complementary, as Ross Greer has said. I particularly like the Minister's Amendment 13, making it clear that the individual must act under the officer's direction at all times, so it doesn't give that person carte blanche or separate immunity, if you like, but they must operate under the officer's direction, which is fine, so they cannot act alone. On Ross Greer's amendments, they actually do, they reiterate the unanimous position of the committee members that we felt in the committee unanimously at Stage 1, our Stage 1 report, that we wanted to make sure that we took any problems away. I think during the Stage 1 debate, the Minister misunderstood the intention of the committee in our committee report. We didn't envisage having enforcement officers to lodge a notification with Police Scotland. That wasn't our intention. Our intention was not to... This would be an operational matter that it would be good practice. Maybe it could be dealt with in briefings to people, but we thought it would be useful to put it in the law as a matter of good practice to actually inform the police on the ground that this was happening before it actually went underway. So the police could, if they wished, react to that. At the moment, they can just do it anyway. And I just think it would be helpful. And if I've got a plea, if it doesn't pass, and suddenly the committee decides to change its mind from a unanimous decision, remarkably, and it changes its mind, would the Minister consider looking at this issue again at stage 3?
Okay, Mr McMillan.
Thank you, Convener. Just looking at the amendments 13 and 33, certainly in the Minister's amendment, I think that the words "to act under the officer's direction at all times" suggests to me that that then actually does what we were looking for when we had when we put forward the stage 1 report. So that aspect of contacting Police Scotland, the Police Service of Scotland, then that actually will be undertaken. So I generally think that the Minister's amendment number 13 actually is doing what we actually suggested in our stage 1 report.
Okay, thanks very much. Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. I think we've heard already this morning and the merits of this process, and I think that has very much been the case. The Minister makes some valid points about that, but I also am sympathetic to the points that Ross Graham makes with reference to 33 and 34, because it is about a balance here. It is about ensuring that the transparency and the necessity that takes place. And for those reasons, Convener, I do feel that I would be happy to support Ross Greer's amendments at this case.
Thank you. Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Convener. So, turning to the committee's report at paragraph 45, page 17, we did recommend, and I quote, that whenever an enforcement officer seeks external expert assistance, the police should be notified in advance. That's what the Stage 1 report had recommended. Can the Minister therefore clarify, because it wasn't clear to me from his initial comments on this section, how he considers that his amendments meet the spirit of what the committee was recommending that he do?
The Minister can come in at the end.
Yes,
yeah.
I don't expect him to come in when he comes in, if
Yes.
he could,
Okay.
inter alia, deal with that point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Claire Baker.
It's actually a follow-on from Annabel Ewing's question, because in section 17, page 6, line 26, the amendment suggested by the Minister refers to officers' directions all the time, but I am assuming that's the enforcement officer, that's not a police officer. And the issue of delay, I do have some sympathy with that, but I'm not convinced that it would cause delay. The requirement is for the police to be notified, not for approval to be given by the police. And I think the examples of the Minister referred to a tow truck, and Ross Greers refers to the cherry picker example. In those circumstances, you would expect a certain amount of disruption on the street, and it would seem reasonable for the police to be aware that that was about to take place. The Minister had described it as prompt, effective and safe, and I think it's probably sensible to inform the police and to notify the police. That would help to ensure a safe environment for when it was necessary for any actions that were taken.
Thank you.
If they could refer to those in closing.
Okay. Ross Greer, do you want to come back in before the Minister winds up?
Yes, just briefly, thanks. Just in response to the interesting point that Mr McMillan made around amendments 33 and 13, does 13 essentially do what I'm intending in 33? It does in part, but not entirely. So I would go back to the example that I gave of if, for example, the enforcement officer required the assistance of a cherry picker operator in proximity to a crowded area. So 13 clarifies that anyone acting with the enforcement officer is acting under their direction. It doesn't, of course, clarify that members of the public are acting under the direction of the enforcement officer. So if this was to happen in a crowded area where you were to use large vehicles, for example, the police could quite reasonably believe that the presence of police officers in that situation would be useful. This is about simply ensuring that the police have the opportunity to make a decision like that because they have been made aware. It doesn't require them to do it because, as I said, those are operational decisions. but it ensures that that opportunity is there, and we leave these issues to be matters of judgment for police officers who are trained to make such decisions.
I now invite the Minister to wind up.
Thank you, Convener, and thanks to all members for their comments. Just to reiterate, Amendments 13 and 18 are about clarifying and emphasising that any party that's used to assist an enforcement officer will be under the direction of an enforcement officer. So just to clarify on the point Claire Baker raised, and that is exactly what 13 and 18 will do if passed. In terms of Ross Greer's amendments 33 and 34, I remain of the view that my amendments better address the concerns that were raised by the committee because they create a consistent requirement for an objective test of necessity to be carried out by the enforcement officer on each occasion they are considering seeking assistance. And they also explicitly state the original policy intention that someone assisting an enforcement officer is under their direction, as I've just said. I thank Ross Greer for his explanation about why he has lodged amendments 33 and 34 and for other members for their comments. However, I'm not persuaded that these would improve the bill and could create delay in a very practical sense, because I think that notification is best left as an operational matter for Glasgow City Council and Police Scotland for their judgment to decide, because, for example, sometimes police will not need to know about the assistance that is being undertaken by a third party under the direction of an enforcement officer, because depending on the form of notifications made, someone in the police may, for example, follow up with an enforcement officer. If I could just finish this one point. Absolutely. So depending on the form of notifications made, someone in the police, for example, may follow up with an enforcement officer, potentially to question their decision, while other notifications may be read may not be read, rather, until after the assistance has already taken place. And I think this has the potential for inconsistent treatment, which could be detrimental and certainly not beneficial. But take the intervention from Claire Baker.
Thank you. I do appreciate that there might be a range of different assistance that they require. Some of it might be minor, some of it might be more significant. But was there any examples from the Commonwealth Games? It's the same legislation. Was there any times where was it common for assistance to be required? Does anybody know any feedback from previous use of legislation?
Examples of where assistance was utilised?
Previously, during the Commonwealth Games, where the legislation was pretty much the same, was it common for enforcement officers to have to call in additional support? And do we have any feedback on were police present? Was it a requirement? Was there large disruption? Or, I mean, you mentioned in the opening statement that there was very little analysis done of how the legislation worked previously. So is it just that we don't have any understanding of how this would work in practice?
I don't have numbers of instances to hand, but I am aware of an instance where abseilers were used, for example, to remove an infringement on the advertising provisions in the bill, in the 2014 bill.
But you don't know how that's a helpful example, but we don't know operationally where the police contacted or we don't know how that worked on the ground, how that...
I can't speak with authority on that right now. That would be something we'd have to check after the committee.
Thank you.
I think there's also a consideration, Convener, in terms of notification about what if police on the ground are not present or are otherwise engaged. This could lead to delay or distract the police from other safety and security matters that they may be dealing with. So for all those reasons, I still think that the amendments 33 and 34 around notification would not be the most. I was just about to wind up, but I'm happy to take an intervention.
Just a very brief one. Does the Minister not think it would be useful to the police to be able to know what's going on?
I think that would be a question for Police Scotland, but my understanding is that there is already dialogue between Glasgow City Council and Police Scotland on these matters, and that is already a process that is well formed and well understood by both parties. So just in conclusion, I think that the amendments, for the reasons stated, I ask the committee to still reject amendments 33 and 34 and to support amendments 12, 13, 17 and 18.
Thank you very much, Minister. The question is that Amendment 12 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Okay. I now like to call Amendment 13 in the name of the Minister, which has already been debated with Amendment 12. Minister, can you formally move Amendment 13?
Formally moved.
Okay. The question is that Amendment 13 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. I'd like to call Amendment 33 in the name of Ross Greer, which has already been debated with Amendment 12. Ross Greer, do you wish to move or not move?
Move, Convener.
The question is that Amendment 13 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? 33, apologies. The question is that Amendment 33 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? There will now be a division. Those in favour of Amendment 33, please show. Those against, please show. Any abstentions? Okay. The amendment is not passed.
We're 4-4. Okay, let's do the vote again.
We're going to do the vote again. Apologies. The question is that Amendment 33 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes. Okay, there will be a division.
There will be a division. Those in favour?
Yeah. Those against?
This is the gate.
You've just voted twice.
Sorry.
Right. Okay, start. Do it again. Do it. Those in favour?
Those in favour.
4, 5. Yeah.
Those against.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Any abstentions? The result is 5 for, 4 against and no abstentions.
Amendment's agreed to.
The amendment is therefore agreed to. I now call Amendment 14 in the name of the Minister, which has already been debated with Amendment 11. Minister, to move formally.
Formally moved, Convener.
The question is that Amendment 14 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The question is that Section 17 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The question is that Section 18 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. I'd like to call Amendment 15 in the name of the Minister, which has already been debated with Amendment 11. Minister, to move formally.
Formally moved, Convener.
The question is that Amendment 15 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. I'd like to call Amendment 3 in the name of Mike Rumbles, which has already been debated with Amendment 11.
No, not moved.
Do any other members wish to move? Okay. The question is that Amendment 3 be agreed. It's not moved. Amendment 3 is not moved.
Amendment 4.
I'd like to call Amendment 4 in the name of Mike Rumbles, already debated with Amendment 11. Mike
Not
Rumbles.
moved.
It's not moved. Do any other members wish to move it?
Sorry.
Okay.
Call Amendment 16.
Call Amendment 16 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 11. Minister, to move formally.
Formally moved.
Okay. The question is Amendment 16 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. I'd like to call Amendment 17 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 12. Minister, to move formally.
Formally moved.
The question is that Amendment 17 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? I'd like to call Amendment 18 in the name of the Minister, which has already been debated with Amendment 12. Minister, to move formally.
Formally moved.
The question is that Amendment 18 be agreed. Are we all agreed? I'd like to call Amendment 34 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 12. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Formally move, Convener.
Okay. The question is that Amendment 34 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes. Be a division.
There will be a division.
Those in favour.
Those in favour of Amendment 34, please show. Those against? Any abstentions?
5-4, 4 against.
The result is 5 for, 4 against and no abstentions.
That's agreed.
The amendment is therefore agreed. I'd like to call Amendment 19 in the name of the Minister, which has already been debated with Amendment 11. The Minister, to move formally.
Formally moved.
The question is that Amendment 19 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The question is that Section 19 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? I'd like to call Amendment 20 in the name of the Minister, grouped with Amendments 21, 22 and 23. Minister, to move Amendment 20 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. This group of amendments respond to the points that have been raised during the Stage 1 process about making explicit in the bill what the process is around consent, where this is not granted, and where this is not granted, the use of reasonable force. I would particularly like to thank Ross Greer for the constructive conversation we had last week on this and other matters. I've also taken this opportunity to further strengthen the safeguards on assistance by a third party where reasonable force is being used. Turning to the detail of each amendment. Amendment 20 makes explicit what was previously implicit in the bill, namely that the potential use of reasonable force would only take place for enforcement action under Section 17 or 19 where permission is not granted by the person able to grant that permission. I've done this to respond to the feedback from the committee during the Stage 1 process. Before I move on to amendments 21, 22 and 23, I want to be clear that where the use of reasonable force takes place, a police constable must always be present already. This recognises the seriousness of using reasonable force, whether or not a warrant has been granted by a sheriff. Amendment 21 removes the power in Section 20, subsection 1, for an enforcement officer to use or authorise the use of reasonable force. It replaces and reframes this so that only the police constable, who is already required to be present where reasonable force is used, may authorise that use of reasonable force, both by an enforcement officer and by any other person assisting an enforcement officer, for example, a locksmith. In addition to making clear the importance of the police constable's role, this amendment further strengthens the safeguards that are in place where the use of a third party for enforcement action takes place. As I mentioned during our discussion of the previous group of amendments, in doing so I have gone further than the Scottish Government had indicated we would in response to the committee's Stage 1 report. Our response had already committed to strengthening the test for receiving assistance from a third party from one of reasonableness to one of necessity, and the amendments in Group 6 combined with Amendment 21 significantly strengthen the safeguards that are in place where a third party assists with enforcement action. Amendment 22 is a minor change to Section 20, subsection 2A, to make clear that the constable is to accompany the enforcement officer in cases where the use of reasonable force has been authorised by a sheriff through the granting of a warrant. Amendment 23 similarly is a minor change to Section 20, subsection 2B, to make clear that the constable is also to accompany the enforcement officer in cases where there is no warrant. In such cases, the bill further provides that the use of reasonable force is only permitted if that same constable on the ground is of the view that the potential delay caused by seeking a warrant for the use of force would defeat or prejudice the purpose of taking enforcement action. I urge members of the committee to support these amendments for the reasons I've set out, and I move Amendment 20.
Thank you. Do any other members wish to contribute? Mr Rumbles.
Thank you very much, Convener. I do actually think that this is an example, a really good example of committee members and the Minister working together to improve this legislation, because legislation, it shouldn't be implicit in what we want to do, it should be explicit. The Minister's amendments make this issue absolutely explicit in the bill, that a constable may use or authorise the use of force and not the enforcement officer. So I really welcome that, and I think it shows, as I say, the committee and the Minister's working at its best to achieve the right result.
Mr Rumbles, Mr Greer.
Thank you, Convener. I'd just like to once again thank the Minister and officials for working with us on this one, and like Mr Rumbles, I think this is an excellent example of where the committee has worked collectively to improve the bill. We would have previously had the slightly odd position of the use of force being granted, and for us to empower anyone to use force is a significant thing to do and should only be done sparingly. We would have been in the odd position where the use of force can be authorised in a situation where a police officer is present, but it's not the police officer authorising that use of force. Now, police officers are by far the most qualified individuals and individuals whose judgment we trust, but also the individuals who have the clearest lines of accountability for any judgments that they make. The amendments in this section, particularly 21, I think provide very useful clarity on where the authorisation for use of force is coming from, and that power rests in these individual situations with the police constable, who is the individual in that situation who would have the most appropriate level of training and the most appropriate lines of accountability where their decisions to be questioned. So I welcome all the amendments in this group.
Thank you. Any other members? Okay, I'd like to invite the Minister to wind up.
Thank you, Convener, and to Mr Rumbles and Mr Greer for their comments and engagement. I hope that I have made clear how seriously I take considerations around using reasonable force when taking action relating to the offences contained in the bill. However, I also want to be clear that I do think that it's important that use of reasonable force is available in order to ensure that effective enforcement action can be taken, and that it is not possible to easily circumvent the restrictions that the bill puts in place on trading, advertising and ticket touting. I think that if these amendments are accepted, the bill will clearly set out the safeguards that are in place where use of reasonable force is being considered and where it then takes place. This includes recognising the important role of the police constable in this process. And for all those reasons and those mentioned throughout the debate together on this group, I would urge members of the committee to support these amendments.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 20 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Okay. I now call Amendments 21, 22 and 23, all in the name of the Minister and all previously debated. Minister, would you like to move Amendments 21 to 23 on block?
Moved on block, Convener.
Thank you. Does any member object to a single question being put on Amendments 21 to 23? No. Okay. The question is that Amendments 21 to 23 are agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The question is that Section 20 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. I now call Amendment 24 in the name of the Minister, grouped with Amendments 27, 28 and 30. Minister, could you move Amendment 24 and speak to all amendments in the group?
Thank you, Convener. This final group contains government amendments making minor and technical changes to the bill. Amendments 24 and 30 correct minor typographical errors in the bill as introduced, and Amendments 27 and 28 change the cross-references to delegated powers in Section 31 so that they refer to specific subsections for greater clarity and consistency. And I ask members of the committee to support these amendments, and I move Amendment 24.
Thank you. Would other members wish to contribute? No. Minister, would you wish to wind up?
No further remarks, Convener.
Okay, thank you. The question is that Amendment 24 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes, please. The question is that Section 21 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. I'd like to call Amendment 25 in the name of the Minister, which has already been debated with Amendment 11. Minister, could you move that formally, please?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 25 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The question is that Section 22 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The amendment, I'd like to call Amendment 26 in the name of the Minister, which has already been debated with Amendment 11.
Moved, Convener.
The question is that Amendment 26 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The question is that Section 23 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The question is that Sections 24 to 30 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? I now call Amendments 27, 28 and 29, all in the name of the Minister and all previously debated. I'd like to invite Minister to move Amendments 27 to 29 on block.
Moved on block, Convener.
And would any other member wish to object to a single question being put on Amendments 27 to 29? Okay. The question is that Amendments 27 to 29 are agreed to. Are we all agreed? The question is that Section 31 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? I now call Amendment 30 in the name of the Minister, which has already been debated with Amendment 24. Minister, could you move that formally, please?
Formally moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 30 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The question is that Section 32 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? I now call Amendment 31 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 7. Minister, could you move that formally?
Moved, Convener.
The question is that Amendment 31 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The question is that Section 33 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? I now call Amendment 32 in the name of the Minister, which has already been debated with Amendment 1. Minister, can you move formally?
Moved, Convener.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 32 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The question is that Section 34 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? And the question is that the long title be agreed to. Are we all agreed? And that ends stage 2 consideration of the bill. Thank you very much. Members should note that the bill will now be reprinted as amended, and this will be available online in hard copy from 8:30 in the morning on Monday. The Parliament has not yet determined when Stage 3 will take place, but members can now lodge Stage 3 amendments at any time with the legislation team, and members will be informed of the deadline for amendments once it has been determined. And we shall now move into private session. Thank you very much.